So how do archaeologists actually piece together one of the most famous, yet surprisingly elusive events in human history? Welcome to this explainer on the Exodus. Today we're diving into the incredible research of Dr. Jeffrey Hudon to see exactly how historians operate like real-life detectives, sifting through sand, stone, and ancient texts to separate fact from mystery. Let's get right into it.
Right off the bat, we got to ask the million-dollar question, does physical archaeological proof actually exist? Now, critical scholars often say no, suggesting that maybe only a tiny handful of slaves ever escaped. But many conservative scholars and Egyptologists argue yes. As we'll see, it's not about finding a giant billboard out in the desert. It's more like piecing together a massive, highly complex puzzle.
Here is our roadmap for the investigation today. First, we'll look at the archaeological mystery itself. Then the circumstantial clues, dating the Exodus, mapping the escape route, searching for Mount Sinai, and finally, tracing their actual footsteps in the wilderness.
All right, and kicking things off with part 1, the archaeological mystery.
The absolute biggest hurdle facing historians is the frustrating absence of a direct, smoking gun. But here's the thing, an absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. Egyptian records are completely silent about the Exodus, which, if you think about it from the perspective of a world-dominating empire, makes perfect sense. Pharaohs simply never carved humiliating defeats or the mass escape of their entire slave workforce into stone. I mean, it would have been an unthinkable PR disaster. Expecting to find a shiny Egyptian monument detailing their own utter downfall? That's just bad detective work.
That brings us to section 2, circumstantial clues and evidence.
Since we don't have that smoking gun, we have to rely on circumstantial clues. And honestly, the case is absolutely fascinating. First off, the Exodus is a deeply embedded cultural memory in Judaism, celebrated continuously through Passover. Second, and this is wild to think about, ancient peoples just didn't invent origin stories where they started out as enslaved people. They loved claiming their ancestors were mighty warriors or literal gods. Add to this the fact that the biblical text uses authentic Egyptian names like Moses and accurately cites real border cities like Pithom and Ramses. Suddenly, a really compelling mosaic of truth starts to form.
This mosaic gets even clearer when you look at the plagues themselves. They weren't just random, chaotic, bad weather. They were highly targeted polemics, basically strategic insults designed to humiliate very specific Egyptian deities. Turning water to blood directly challenged the god of the Nile. Swarms of frogs mocked the Egyptian frog deity, and that devastating death of the firstborn, that was a direct strike against Pharaoh's own divine status, showcasing total impotence before the Hebrew god.
Moving right along to section 3, when did it happen?
Scholars are basically divided into two major schools of thought here, and they're separated by both dynasty and geography. The early date theory places the Exodus in the 18th dynasty, roughly around 1445 BC, when the Egyptian capital was way down south in Thebes. The late date theory puts it in the 19th dynasty, around 1290 BC, with the capital up north in Memphis. Now, the early date strictly follows biblical chronology, while the late date aligns beautifully with the massive real-world city-building projects of Pharaoh Ramses II. Let's zoom in on that early timeline for just a second. If Moses was born around 1526 BC, the famous female pharaoh Hatshepsut might have actually been the princess who rescued him from the Nile. We also see Thutmose III taking the throne in 1479 BC. He was arguably the most powerful Egyptian pharaoh in all of history. But here's the kicker. His oldest son mysteriously did not succeed him. Could he have died in the 10th plague? We can't know for sure, but it is a tantalizing chronological clue that makes the 18th dynasty a super strong candidate.
So both Thutmose III and Ramses II fit very distinct profiles as our prime suspects. While the early date has those compelling chronological ties we just talked about, the late date camp argues for Ramses II because the texts explicitly state the Israelites built the city of Ramses. Plus, his capital at Memphis was way closer to the Israelite settlements in the Delta, which would make Moses' frequent back-and-forth visits to the pharaoh logistically possible. The who in this story remains a beautifully debated mystery.
Okay, section 4, mapping the escape route.
Historical records, like the wall murals from the campaign of Seti I, highlight what was known as the shore of Egypt. Now, this wasn't just a picturesque line in the sand. We're talking about an intimidating network of moats, literally filled with crocodiles, massive gates, and heavily armed fortresses. Escaping slaves wouldn't just be walking out the back door, they were facing a total impenetrable military lockdown.
Because of those fortresses, we can use simple logic to deduce their path. Step 1. Avoid the obvious. The shortest way to Canaan was the northern coastal road, but it was dotted with Egyptian garrisons, spaced exactly a day's march apart. No way they go that route. Step 2. Detour south into the uncharted wilderness to avoid the military entirely. And Step 3. Cross the Yam Suf, or the Sea of Reeds. The exact location of that crossing, by the way, remains one of archaeology's greatest unsolved debates.
Which perfectly sets up Section 5, searching for Mount Sinai.
Just like the date of the Exodus, the location of Mount Sinai is fiercely split between two major candidates. On one side, we have the traditional site, Jebel Musa in the southern Sinai Peninsula, home to the ancient St. Catherine's Monastery. This tradition goes all the way back to the 4th century AD, but on the flip side is a fascinating alternative. Jebel al-Lawz in northern Saudi Arabia, the region of ancient Midian. We know Moses fled to Midian, so geographically this makes a lot of sense. But logistically, crossing the deep trench of the Gulf of Aqaba to get there presents massive problems for a huge migrating population.
Interestingly, at an Egyptian mining operation in the Sinai called Serabit el-Qadim, archaeologists found something truly groundbreaking. They discovered early Semitic peoples transitioning from drawing pictures to using a simplified, sound-based alphabet. Why does this matter for our story? Well, for a people group about to receive a massive written legal code like the Ten Commandments, this evolutionary step in language happening right there in the Sinai provides incredibly relevant context.
Finally, we reach Section 6, Traces in the Wilderness.
Let's be honest, finding the remains of a nomadic people wandering a desolate desert for 40 years is incredibly tough. But we do have a few anchor points. One relatively certain encampment is the oasis of Kadesh Barnea, located right on the border. Excavators have actually found Midianite pottery there dating to the time of the Exodus, which is a fantastic piece of evidence. But as we continue along their route, other locations, like the city of Heshbon, present a completely different puzzle.
Let's look a little closer at this Heshbon puzzle. The biblical text says Moses and the Israelites completely destroyed the kingdom of Sihon the Amorite at Heshbon. Yet decades of extensive archaeological digging at the site have revealed absolutely zero late Bronze Age ruins from the time of Moses. None. So does that mean the whole story's made up? Actually, scratch that. Not necessarily. The texts tell us these Amorites were recent arrivals who violently conquered the area. It is entirely possible they were a nomadic warrior kingdom still living in tents rather than brick-and-mortar cities. And burning tents don't exactly leave massive stone ruins for modern archaeologists to find 3 millennia later.
But then, out of nowhere, you get these moments of pure archaeological magic. In 1967, a Dutch archaeologist excavating north of Moab found a plastered wall covered in ancient Aramaic writing. When translated, this 9th century text explicitly mentions a revered historical figure named Balaam the seer. This is the exact same witch doctor hired to curse the Israelites in the texts. Now, finding this one wall doesn't prove the entire Exodus narrative in one fell swoop, obviously, but man, it stunningly confirms the historical reality of its peripheral characters.
I think this quote from Dr. Hudon perfectly captures why this whole detective story matters. He says, "Nothing concrete, no smoking gun here. But find after find gives evidence. Indirect evidence, but evidence nonetheless." It's a great reminder that ancient history isn't always handed to us neatly carved in stone. More often than not, it's reconstructed through fragments, scattered names, cultural memories, and sheer geographic logic.
Which brings us to our final point today. If a mosaic of circumstantial evidence can begin to rebuild a 3,000-year-old journey across a desolate wilderness, I leave you with this thought to ponder. What other forgotten histories are waiting just beneath the sand? Thank you for joining me on this explainer. I really encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep digging into the incredible mysteries of our shared past.